This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. This episode is sponsored by Funding Loop. Funding Loop automates the process for nurseries of collecting funding forms from parents and typing that information into council portals. To find out more about Funding Loop, visit their website. You'll find the link in this episode description. Hiya, just a really quick message from me. I'd really love to ask for a little favor from those listening and watching. So wherever you're listening, wherever you're watching on, whatever platform it is, please do hit the subscribe button. This really helps the Voice of Early Childhood to continue putting out those thought-provoking episodes and continue making sure that we share those diverse voices and give you the topics and guests that you want to hear from. And for those of you who already subscribe, thank you very much. This helps so much. And everyone, thank you for listening, watching, and supporting the Voice of Early Childhood. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica Solinska. I'm your host. And today, the topic is reflecting on the impact of domestic abuse on children. So just a warning for all listeners and viewers, this episode can be distressing as we are discussing domestic abuse. So today I'm joined by Tina Pokuaah, who's a safeguarding consultant at Kesis Consulting. So thank you very much, Tina, for joining to talk about this really important topic.
Thank you for having me.
It's as I said, it's not a comfortable thing to talk about, but this is something that you do, I guess, on a daily basis, really, isn't it? And I guess just to begin with, before we look at the statistics, maybe give us a little overview of what it is that you actually do and what does that look like day to day?
So I'm a safeguarding consultant, which requires me to deliver training, webinars. I do audits, I write policies. I also am able to kind of help create spaces where people are just able to kind of share their experiences. And this stemmed from many years ago. Kind of fell into it, but previously I was an IDVA, so independent domestic violence advisor. And that's where I really gained experience on understanding the impact of domestic abuse on victims and their children. I also did group counselling with survivors of domestic abuse as well. So I kind of bring these experiences to life when I am doing consultancy, helping professionals kind of really understand domestic abuse and what they could put in place to be able to support their clients, service users, children, young people that they work with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you have got a lot of experience, understanding and knowledge in this area. So let's firstly have a look at the statistics around domestic abuse. And I know that before we pressed record, you did mention the fact that we need to kind of take statistics around this area with a pinch of salt. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about that, including any statistics that we do have?
So if we're just thinking generally, statistics suggest that 1 in 4 women experience domestic abuse, 1 in 5 children. We're considering that during pregnancy, that there's a 30% increase of victims falling to experiencing domestic abuse. But as we mentioned, when we think about statistics, it's about taking it or looking at it with a pinch of salt, because we know that statistics or numbers will definitely be much higher, considering some people haven't been able to disclose their experiences, they haven't been given the opportunity, maybe it hasn't been recorded. So just making sure we recognise that the numbers are definitely much higher and this is much more prevalent than we like to think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess also, we mentioned women and children, and of course we're hearing more and more that men also are victims of domestic abuse as well. And I guess the statistics for that would be even more unreliable, really, and we can never tell because it's so difficult for men to talk about their mental health, and there's all of the stigma around that, and it's just not accepted in this society still to this day, which is really concerning, although we are so much more open about mental health and things like that. So I guess that's It's even more to kind of, it's even more difficult to understand and dig deeper there as well. Is that
Yeah.
something that your work involves as well, working
So
with
I've
men?
seen statistics suggest that 1 in 7 men, but as you mentioned, the stigma behind it, we know that men can be victims. However, being able to kind of have that safe space to share that,
Hmm.
there's a few services available, but not so much as
Mm.
there for women. We know that women are more likely to be victims, but that doesn't dismiss the fact that men are victims and unfortunately have also been murdered as a result. So it's a conversation that we need to have so that men could feel more comfortable sharing their experiences and getting the help and support that they need. So yeah, really looking at it from both perspectives is really key.
Hmm. And I guess so. Your work has mainly involved working with women and children. Hmm.
Yes, I'm
Hmm.
just speaking from that experience, but yeah, I definitely do acknowledge that men can be victims as well.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of the things that we will talk about are applicable anyway. It's just then looking at it from a different lens of how do we now support men because there are other barriers as well. But let's begin with, I guess, talking about what what can we do to make sure that, I guess we talked about these statistics. What can we do to make sure that more people are comfortable is like the wrong word because you're never going to be comfortable speaking up about if you are experiencing domestic abuse. What can we do to ensure that it's more likely for people to speak up? You said about creating safe spaces.
Think just having that open dialogue, having these conversations,
Mm.
like we still got a long way to go, but with, for example, mental health, like people are much more open about their mental health because we've kind of created that space now where people can articulate how they're feeling, what help they've received, what help they might need. And in the same
Mhm.
means, we can start doing that around domestic abuse. So once we start having these conversations, people can, first and foremost, kind of understand what it is, recognize the signs and indicators. We've come a long way from just believing domestic abuse is just a physical incident. We know it is much more complex than that. So having these
Mm.
conversations allows us to understand what are the different forms of domestic abuse. While someone might not be experiencing the physical side of stuff, they might be being controlled, they might be experiencing financial abuse, the spiritual abuse. There's so many different forms of domestic abuse that we need to be aware of so that if we do need the help or someone that we do know needs the help, we can kind of signpost them to the right service. So first and foremost, I would say educate ourselves about domestic abuse. What are the different forms?
Mhm.
What are the different signs and indicators, both for, men, women, as well as children, and just creating that space where it might be the case where we start that conversation with someone because we have concerns. We're worried about, changes in their character or we've noticed something, maybe we've seen a bruise, etc. And if we just avoid it, it's not going to help. So maybe just, is everything all right at home? Does anyone do anything that makes you feel hurt or uncomfortable? And whilst they might not be at that time ready to share with you, recognizing that disclosure is often the journey. So the fact that you've created that safe space, you've let them know that you care, you are not being judgmental, you're being sensitive. When they are ready, you might be that person that they will come to because you've already created that safe space. So
Mhm.
definitely educating yourself. And if someone's able to kind of share their experiences with you, don't dismiss it. Acknowledge their experience. Encourage them for, being brave to share it with you and encourage them to reach out. Are you familiar with any services, whether locally or nationally, that you can share with them, signpost them to? Because it's all right them sharing this information with you now, but what are they going to do afterwards? And it might be the case where they do want the additional help, but they just don't know who to
Mhm.
turn to. Um, with a service, they might be able to kind of support them in creating a safety plan, but this is a conversation you could have with them as well. So it might be, for example, okay, if you're ever going through an emergency or an emergency, obviously call the police, but if you're not available to, just call me, like as a friend, maybe a friendship group. Let's have a code word together. So if you called me and you just said a code word, I know that you're in danger. I will call the police. So you can be able to kind of create a safety plan with that individual as well. You can encourage them to document anything if it's safe. It might be the case that every time there's an incident, they might message you or email or whatever it may be. And at least you have a record of it for them if ever needed as evidence. But there's so many different ways, as a community, whether friends, whether family, and then even more so as a practitioner, we have that duty of care, we have that responsibility to make those referrals. But, generally as a community, there's so much more we can be doing. It's just starting off with having these conversations, acknowledging what domestic abuse is, and not pressuring someone, especially if it's someone close to you. We almost want to drag them out the situation.
Yeah.
We care about them, we love them, but we need to recognize that by forcing them to do something that they're not quite ready to do, that also might be seen as a form of control. So they might be being controlled in their relationship already, and then we're now trying to control them to make decisions that they're not ready to do. So it's just encouraging them, supporting them, letting them know that you're there. So when that time is right, that they will know that you can be that person that they can speak to. And just maybe providing practical support as well. There's so many barriers and challenges preventing someone from leaving an abusive relationship. And often in society, you may hear, well, if it was that bad, I didn't leave a long time ago. What is it that we can support them with that it will enable them to leave? So it might be challenges such as finances, children. It could be their culture, their religion. It could be they might be on a spousal visa. There's so many different reasons why someone might not be able to leave immediately. So just asking them, what support do you need? And kind of helping them thereafter, and knowing what services you can signpost them to as well. So banks are doing great at raising awareness around financial abuse. So it could be the case you can just support them attending an appointment with their bank to see what they could put in place. So yeah, there's so many different options, but we just need to understand, we need to acknowledge it, we need to know what it is so that we can start having these conversations.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess so many of these things that you've mentioned around the signs, educators working with children and families and healthcare professionals, they would already be very much attuned to and aware of in terms of safeguarding. And, it's the training that been to and their responsibility and their legal responsibility. But I guess it's just understanding all of the nuanced and the additional things to look out for in terms of domestic abuse. So you talked about financial abuse as one example, and maybe we can talk about some others as well. But if we're thinking about an educator in the nursery and the safeguarding course that they've gone on, they may not necessarily recognize the signs of domestic abuse, and especially, like you mentioned, financial abuse. So can you give us some examples of what that might look like and what to look out for that we may not usually kind of consider?
So just taking a holistic approach. So it might be the case, for example, you're aware that the parent is working. However, there might be like additional resources that the child might need, might be going on a trip, for example, and the parent is saying that she's struggling financially, she can't afford to buy these extra resources, or she can't afford to allow the child to go on this activity, whatever it may be. But you know that they're working, they have a good job, and they haven't really let you know, for example, what they might be going through financial crisis, but there's something behind it. So just asking, is there anything we can do to support you? Is there anything we can do to let you know what other additional services you might require? And this might open a conversation about, okay, well, I don't have control over my money, so I have to maybe ask my partner first and see what they say. So it's just about starting these conversations to kind of identify what potentially may be wrong. So financial abuse might be a bit difficult within the earlier settings, but potentially, as I said, it might be the case where the parent, the parent works, the parent has a good income, but for some reason they always have to maybe ask their partner for consent to be able to do additional stuff with their children, etc. We're thinking about physical abuse. You might just see, obviously, bruises. You might see changes in their characteristics, taking a holistic approach. And even within the children, you might see, maybe a regress in their development. You might see that they have experiencing separation anxiety when previously there wasn't any concerns. They might be extra sensitive, crying even more. It might be issues with their sleeping. Often, especially for secondary school students, I often let teachers know that sometimes we make the assumption that maybe when a child falls asleep in class is because they were up watching Netflix or playing PlayStation. But it might be the case there was an incident at home that child couldn't sleep, and that's why they're sleeping in class. So even with a child in early years, like some of the signs that they're showing, it might be the case where they can't concentrate, their behavior suddenly change. Maybe they were that child that was very bubbly, and all of a sudden they become very withdrawn, very isolated. And then you also have concerns with the parents. So it's really about being professionally curious, like wanting to know more, asking questions, not taking, one piece of evidence as, the be and end all. We need to make sure that we are curious so we can be able to safeguard that child, that family, as soon as possible. And then, for a mother who might be pregnant as well, just recognizing, as I said, the statistics suggest that there's a 30% increase. So also making sure that they are getting the help and support. Is everything all right? How's the pregnancy? How are you? Often we put so much emphasis on the child, which is important, but also how are you? How are you feeling? Are you getting the right support? And they might come up with things like, I'm feeling very tired. I don't feel like I'm getting the support. That they've got a partner. So it's just asking questions, and then we can identify things that they might pick. Things that they might say, we can kind of pick out and, ask additional open questions to see what's going on in their life.
Yes, and when you were mentioning, some of the things that we can ask around the finances aspect, so that is a really difficult one because it can seem like you're asking too many questions and being too almost like nosy and pushy. But as you said, it's about that professional curiosity, and we as educators or healthcare professionals, we need to exercise that professional curiosity and recognize that it is our duty of care, that whole family. So I guess when you were, again, giving some examples around the physical signs and more emotional and examples with children, these are all similar signs that we can see in other forms of abuse. But I guess the point is that it's all forms of abuse. It's important to take them seriously, any kind of signs. And it's all about recording it, passing it on, taking it seriously. And as you say, taking that holistic approach. So looking at the family, at the parents, carers, as well as the child, because it's our duty of care. The whole family is our duty. We have that duty of care, and not just for the child. So I guess it really is, the underpinning phrase here is holistic and holistic approach, isn't it?
Exactly.
And in terms of, so we discussed the professional kind of side of things. I know you also talk about and do training around personal situations as well. So it might be that it's a friend or family member or a neighbour that you kind of notice these signs. So what do we do in that situation? Because it's quite different, isn't it, in terms of, again, duty of care. It's not a legal responsibility. As an educator, you're removed from that.
It's different, but we also can potentially be more connected with that person. So sometimes we can allow our own emotions to kind of get in the way. So as I mentioned, sometimes, situations with someone we really care about, we're kind of forcing or pressuring them to leave that relationship immediately. But what's important is that we are aware of services that we can kind of support them in attending. It might be the case where they're really afraid, but they need some support in attending an appointment or making that phone call. And just, really getting to understand what they're experiencing, how that's impacting them as well. And as I said, really important to ask them, what support do you need? Those practical supports can really make a difference. It might be the case where, could I, just pick up the children so that I can just have some time to breathe because we've had a incident here and I'm just really feeling overwhelmed. That might be a situation where you can be able to step in. But, really recognizing when people have children, especially, as a vulnerable adult, we have a responsibility as well. Safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. And even if we're not in a professional capacity, knowing that services are there and services need to be taken seriously and make a referral so that that family can get the help and support that they need. So it's just helping them through the process. Okay, I will attend appointments with you. I can kind of help you articulate anything that you might be finding difficult, but it's not fair and it's not right for a child to grow up in a home experiencing domestic abuse. We know that it has long-term impacts on them, thinking about their own cognitive, their social, their development. We're thinking about, as adults, what that could lead to. So whether taking substances, whether getting involved in criminal activities, even just the normalization of unhealthy relationships. And that often happens. Like when we think about perpetrator behavior, not to justify it at all, but some of their ideas is that, this is what I grew up in. This is the only thing I saw, so I normalized it. And it's important that we break those patterns, and we can only do that by holding each other accountable, by making sure that we are providing the support and knowing that there are services that we can access. In the UK, we have these services. I believe that that's the village. We often hear the term, it takes a village, and services that we have in the UK is that village. So everyone has that right and entitlement to access it. And sometimes people are just not aware. So really sharing these conversations, but also educating ourselves so that we know who to signpost them to and what services that we could recommend.
I guess when you talk about, the perhaps the abuser, and that they normalize that abusive behavior because that's what they've seen. So there are also services to potentially support them in changing their behavior as well and changing the family situation.
Yeah, there's Perpetrator programs available across the UK. There is an organisation called For Baby's Sake as well. They work with the family holistically to kind of really understand what they are doing or what they are experiencing. And if the family wants to stay together, like what they can kind of put in place to be able to safeguard themselves and their children to grow up in a healthy home, to grow up in a healthy relationship. So it's about whether if that perpetrator is willing to take responsibility and be held accountable, there is support out there for them. But it's acknowledging what they're doing is wrong, what they're doing is abuse. So yeah, it really depends on they're willing to. You can't force them. And that's why we need to kind of prioritize the safety of the victim and the child. So whether the perpetrator takes responsibility or not, it's about making sure we prioritize the safety of the victim and the child by every means necessary.
Yes, of course. And in terms of, we talked about ways of receiving support. In terms of the barriers to this, I know that there's a few things to discuss here as well.
Yeah, there's many barriers and challenges. So, yeah, as I said, sometimes we're just so quick to judge, but thinking about what potentially that victim is considering as to why they're not ready to leave that relationship, or they don't feel that they can. So it could be the case, as we're mentioning, children, like whether they don't want their children to be raised in a single parent family. Maybe, they grew up in a single parent family themselves, understand the challenges, or they grew up in a 2-parent household and that's what they want for their children. So that's a challenge in itself, especially the children's ages, maybe the relationship dynamics between them and the perpetrator. There's so many different scenarios just looking at children alone. It could be the case where they are challenges in terms of their religion. Sometimes you hear phrases such as divorce is a sin, and that could stop or prevent someone from leaving. Their culture, honor-based abuse might happen if they try and leave that relationship. It could be the case where the person's on a spousal visa, so limited access to funds, etc. It could be finances. Love alone is a challenge. Love is a very strong emotion, and then if they feel that that person is someone that they love deeply and they hold on to the hope that that person can change. I don't know if you've ever heard of the cycle of abuse, where it describes that cycle where someone holds on to the idea that maybe the person that they first met will come back. So, when we go on a date, no person is abusive initially. They often change after time, with years, months, etc. The cycle of abuse describes, there's a tension period, then there is an incident, and then the person apologizes, say, I'm really sorry, I was having a really bad day, I didn't mean to take it out on you. And then we're going back to the honeymoon period where everything is all sweet, everything's all calm, and you hold on to that hope that, that person that you once met, that's who they've come back again, and everything's going to be okay. And it might take a few days, it may take a few weeks, months, years, and there's never another incident again, potentially. But then again, tension starts building up. You notice that they're giving you attitude, you're feeling like you're walking on eggshells, you're feeling frightful, and then the incident takes place again. And then again, they say sorry, and then there's a honeymoon period. So it's just that cycle where it's so difficult. Statistics, I think, suggest that it takes victims 7 times to be able to leave an abusive relationship. And
As
even
in
at that
like
point,
7 times of
seven
trying to
attempts,
leave
yeah,
and
yeah,
yeah.
7 attempts to be able to
Hmm.
um, potentially thinking about it, putting things in place, but it could take 7 times, and that could potentially be over years. So it's not
Hmm.
always so easy. And then that moment when a woman decides to leave an abusive relationship, that's when her life is most at risk. So it's really important that we create that safety planning, and thinking about what things we can put in place to ensure the safety of them and their children. So it's not as easy and straightforward as often society may articulate it. So we really recognizing these barriers and challenges is really important.
Hmm. And in terms of the barriers and challenges involved within, I guess, diversity as well. So there's a couple of things to think about there, different groups of people as well, isn't there?
Definitely. So even just thinking about age, so older people might be concerned, like how are they able to even speak to anybody to get that help and
Mm.
support? They might have mobility issues. The abuser might also be their carer, so they're relying on them as
Right,
well.
okay.
We're thinking about those who might have disabilities. We're thinking about, potentially those from different races, cultures. So a key theme, I don't know if you've heard about it, is Valerie's Law. They
Okay.
campaign for professionals, particularly police officers, to get more training around domestic abuse and cultural competency to understand the challenges that Black women face experiencing domestic abuse. So Valerie, unfortunately, was murdered by her ex-partner despite her reporting to the police on several occasions that she was experiencing domestic abuse because of the complexion of her skin. Evidence that the police wanted wasn't so evident on her skin as it would have been on a
Mm.
person. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, she was murdered alongside her, I believe, 2-year-old daughter, a
Hmm.
child in early years. So, Sister Space, which is a specialist service in Hackney, working with Black victims of domestic abuse, they are campaigning for this law to be put in place so that, yeah, professionals, particularly police officers, will be trained around cultural competency. So,
Mm.
yeah, there's so many different challenges, barriers. As I said, your culture, your religion could play a huge impact as well. So, thinking about how it's experienced, thinking about how you're supported, really does have a toll on victims and
Hmm.
so many decisions that they'll have to make.
Hmm. And I guess a big takeaway here as well is the fact that there's so much more training that is required around all of this because as we touched on there some of these I guess signs and how do we support people as well are very it's all around safeguarding and it's all interlinked but actually as we discussed there's extra things to look out for, to understand, to be aware of, to have training on. And as you described there with the police services, it's also so important for obviously healthcare and the education sector to have the training and within the safeguarding training that they do to also have the training around domestic abuse. And it's not just this is maybe even not just like this is another form of abuse, but actually there's just so much more there because it's so much more interlinked with everything and can get quite complicated and confusing and mistaken. And then sometimes maybe even almost forgotten about because, as we said, a lot of the time there's that focus on the child, but
Mm-hmm.
actually it's the whole family we need to be looking at. And then, of course, that impacts the child anyway.
Definitely. We're looking at like homicide reviews, serious case reviews. Domestic abuse is something that evidently always comes up. So it's something that needs to be looked
Mm-hmm.
at on its own. Even like thinking about antenatal classes, I know there's a question, are you experiencing domestic abuse? But often professionals rush through that question. They don't actually give the space for someone to be able to answer that. And if someone's going through it, they might not be quite ready at that point to share
Yeah.
that. So it's about how do we kind of let them know that whilst you might not be ready yet, please do know that
Mm-hmm.
I am that safe person you could speak to, and this is what domestic abuse looks like. So
Mm.
I don't know if you've ever seen the resource called the Power and Control Wheel, which kind of really describes different incidences that a victim might go through, and it's only usually using that victim could say, "Okay, that's been my experience." People
Mm.
articulate still now domestic abuse, physical. They've had to hit me, they've had to kick me, they've had to punch me, but we know
Mm-hmm.
it's much more complex than that. But sometimes people are not able to articulate what they're experiencing
Yeah.
until kind of really delve into what domestic abuse is. So I believe that domestic abuse, as it stands, should be a training on its own, not just generally under
Mm.
safeguarding. Obviously, it's a safeguarding concern and we cover it. So even in my safeguarding training, we have a spotlight, 20 minutes talking about domestic abuse, but thinking about how many different forms of abuse we need to understand, the signs and indicators,
Mm.
the impacts, who affects the barriers and challenges, the services. Like there's so much we can be talking about this for the whole day. So yeah.
Yeah, of course. And you just made me think about actually education for younger people as well, because when you talked about this, asking the question, have you experienced domestic abuse? Some people don't even know if they have. And as you said, don't know what it looks like. So I guess it's educating young people, maybe even almost
Really good.
children, of like, this is what a healthy relationship looks like. Yeah.
Yeah,
And this is what domestic
exactly.
abuse can look like.
Soon as they can start communicating, because you just start off talking about friendships, like what makes a
Mm.
healthy friendship? How does a good friend make you feel? How does a bad friend make you feel? This is when we start, as they get older, the conversations get a bit more complex, but this is when we start. I've worked with young people who experience domestic abuse, and it's unfortunate how they've kind of normalized things like they will say, oh, well, if a guy's really jealous, that means he really loves you. And I'm like, jealousy and love are two very different emotions,
Mm.
but for them, that's a sign of control, but for them, that's a sign of love. So it's really
Mhm.
important that we kind of share and educate with children as soon as possible. There's a campaign actually currently happening from her parents where a young girl, 14 years old, was murdered by her boyfriend.
Oh
And
gosh.
it really aims to,
Mm.
her parents are hoping that the Domestic Abuse Act will lower the age. Currently it's 16, so they want it to be lowered. But it just shows that we need to really start educating, empowering our children, both girls and boys, to understand what a healthy, unhealthy relationship is, knowing what support to get, how to get the support, and just, yeah, start having these conversations. It's just really
Mhm.
important. We need to
Mhm.
get started.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the big key takeaways from this is opening up these conversations and, like you said, opening up these safe spaces and allowing people to feel comfortable to be able to talk about this topic, whether they are going through it or, just generally talking about this is uncomfortable, as we mentioned at the start. So thank you very much, Tina, for sharing your insight, your knowledge on this really, really important topic, opening up our minds to it a little bit more. And for everyone who's listening, Tina's article is available on the Voice of Early Childhood website. And also, if you are someone who is experiencing domestic abuse or know anyone who is, you can find a list of support services available in Tina's article as well, national organisations. And of course, there's also local ones to you to kind of find and source as well. So thank you once again, Tina, very much for talking about this. As I mentioned, difficult topic. It's always uncomfortable, no matter how many years of training and experience you have, I guess. So yeah, thank you for sharing this space.
Thank you.